He didn't realize until the door swept shut behind him with the elevators was made of glass designed to ride up the outer spine of the building. Again, at a loss of breath, he stared out through the thick glass as the city unfolded outward beneath him, an origami bound by invisible hands as he rocketed up towards the clouds. View from the glass capsule was staggering as Salvador Dali canvas come to life. The lights were beginning to sparkle along with the Golden Mile as the dusk gave way to night, and the harbor glowed in the neon from nearly advertisement billboards and ubiquitous disco pearls. Calvin was a schizophrenic fantasy with an Asian theme, the Hong Kong of postcards and travelers. Growing up in New Jersey, Malcolm had never dreamed that he'd visit the city. Certainly, he'd never expected that he'd lodge in a glass elevator, ascending toward a lavish party floating high in the Hong Kong sky. As the elevator approached the city's floor, he couldn't help thinking about Saya and the way she had watched him with the concert while he had hastily picked his small travel bag 2 days ago. He wished she could have come with him, at the very least to share the view from the glass elevator. Maybe she'd understand the opportunity like she didn't come easily to people with his background. Maybe she'd realize that her opinions of Carney were unjustified, that Malcolm's job was more than just sitting at a desk punching numbers. The trading in nature was seeking opportunities, analyzing absurd situations, and making bets that nobody else could make because you were one step ahead of competition, or 30 floors above them. Lost in the sea of clouds, Malcolm thought about just past 2 days, the whirlwind of meeting lunch, phone calls, face-to-face, and using Carney's connection, and his own. He'd managed to meet with nearly everyone of import in the Hong Kong trading scene. He talked to them of all: Merrill, Goldman, Morgan, Deutsche Bank, the heads of trading at every desk large enough to handle the deal. So far he'd come empty, disheartened, a little confused. It was a very large deal involving $225 million worth of shares being bought through the open market, and Malcolm had assumed the buy order would be easier to trace, but nobody he talked to had scoped to own the deal, and nobody had the idea whose deal it was. Back in Tokyo and everywhere else, Malcolm knew that traders were buying Pacific Century Cyberworks like crazy. His own order for $10 million worth had gone rough, and Carney had called him a dozen times since then, asking when he was going to buy more. But Malcolm didn't want to buy more without knowing the details, or at very least pinning toward who was making the deal for the Hong Kong government. The truth was, he was beginning to wonder what was exactly going on. This should have been much easier. Malcolm wasn't overly concerned, however, because he had one more trader to speak to, one more stop of his tour to Hong Kong, and since nobody else had owned up to the deal, Malcolm was pretty certain that fortnight he was going to hit the jackpot. The last trader of his, who was also the biggest, certainly big enough to handle the tracker deal. The elevator came to the abrupt halt, the door swept open. Malcolm was immediately hit by the wave of sound. Big band music, clink of champagne glass, the scuff-high heels against a marble jaw, and voices, hundreds of voices that seemed like dozens of languages. He stepped out of the elevator into a smoke-cried hallway and headed toward a pair of wide-open double doors. Once through the doors, he found himself in the mouth of a huge loft-like space with floor-to-ceiling windows, multiple chambers, and right in the center, massive ice sculpture of a man swinging a baseball bat. The sculpture was the first obvious that he was the right party. He recognized Ted Williams, the heroic Red Sox watcher with the tilt of his head, a measure on his transparent blue eyes. Vince Mayers, at the top trader of one of the biggest American banks in Hong Kong, was a long way from the town where he'd grown up, attended college, and played little football. But he was obviously kept Boston in his heart. Репетитор по скайпу, Smart Teacher 197.